Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spaniola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversations with everyday folks about the mystery of life. I'm your host, Carmen Spaniola, joining you from the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. Those are the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations, colonially known as Victoria, BC, Canada. This is part 2 of our 7-episode miniseries on Planetary Magic and Propitiation. We began on a Sunday with Eliza Robertson talking about the sun, and here we are on a Monday, and I'm speaking with Bronwyn Simons about moon magic and wisdom. Bronwyn and I both live on Vancouver Island, even though we are a few hours apart. Still, we're both island gals. And I really enjoy following Bronwyn on Instagram. I've learned so much from her about, well, just so many different aspects of astrology. But as soon as I had the idea to do a series on planetary magic, I knew I wanted her to speak about the moon. She just really embodies what she calls lunar consciousness, at least for me. Well, actually, she'll tell you how her makeup, astrologically, she's made for this. She was made for this episode. Bronwyn is an award-winning astrologer with extensive teaching experience who also brings mediumship skills to her work. And she's very generous and eloquent in her teaching, and I'm delighted to share this conversation with you now. And at the end, I'll tell you how you can work with Bronwyn and the moon this summer. But for now, enjoy. So great to have you on the show, Bronwyn. Thank you for saying yes to being here. I'm going to ask you the same question I ask everyone. What identities do you lead with?
It's such a good question for me as a mercurial person. We were talking about this before I came on. With Gemini as my ascendant, Mercury is my ruling planet, and that word mercurial really applies because my lifetime has kind of been a lifetime of shifting identities. And I think what's prominent right now in the midst of my second Saturn return is leaning into identifying as an elder and everything that carries with it. I'm first generation white lady on native land here in Qualicum Beach. I'm autistic, which I'm just starting to be more out about. So my awkwardness is my superpower. And I'm a spirit worker. So I think those are the pieces that are right up there right now. Elder is the big one.
Beautiful, exciting. You know how excited I am about elderhood. Can't wait to be there myself. Always grateful to have eldering. So this is a very exciting moment for me. So you're here to lead us through what you call the gateway, the relationship with the moon. I would love for you to say more about how the moon is the gateway to what?
Yeah, to understanding of cyclical time. And understanding cyclical time is really the key to learning or being initiated into the wisdom of astrology. And it's a very different worldview or mindset than what we learn or what we're indoctrinated into in this culture, which is very linear, very solar, with always the concept of timelines. And the moon teaches us about repetition and spiraling and the equal balance of light and dark. That is really the rule of all of nature. And because she cycles so rapidly, as we are being initiated into astrological knowledge, and this is one sense in which she's a gateway, she teaches us what those cycles that we also see in the planets, because the planets, of course, have phases and cycles. She teaches us to embody those cycles because of that rapid movement. So we have a full Saturn cycle in 30 years. I was just referencing my Saturn return. We have a full lunar cycle in 30 days. But we go through similar experiences with each of those cycles. So she teaches us how to cycle and how the bigger natural cycles in our lives.
It's beautiful to think of the moon in that kind of way. Now, I notice you're using she, her, and I have always been brought up to think of the moon in a female as female or having being more woman identified. I know there are other cultures where the sun is gendered as woman and the moon is gendered as man. And most of the astrologers I'm around seem very fluid in gender, or at least, are not too bound up on whether or not a planet or a heavenly body is supposed to be coded male or female. I'm just curious, how do you hold gender with the moon?
I think this is a really important question. And yes, many different cultures and different individuals handle this in different ways. I think it's really just as with our own gender identity, that's really interesting with the moon, because yes, our culture does view her, even Western astrology, when we go back to the roots of Western astrology, the moon is now associated with mother, but hasn't always been. So I choose, and I do choose those pronouns consciously for her, I think more because of my own lunar placement and my own identities. And these planetary archetypes transcend human choices around gender. And I love that there's so much work being done now to uproot the sticky and unhelpful connections of our society's ideas about gender to the way gender is used in astrology. Because in traditional astrology, the planets are gendered, but there can be really different ways of thinking about that aren't attached to human gender identities. So long story short, I think this is a choice that each of us can make for ourselves with the moon and with each of the planets, where it lands for us in our conception of the whole spectrum of gender, where it lands for us in our own chart and our own way of being, and the way that we as individuals express different aspects of gender in our own lives, and where that lands for us. So I would encourage you and everyone to not just take the traditional view and assume a certain gender for a planet, but really think it through. Where does that land for you among your own identities? And how do you choose to integrate that? And especially with the moon, because she is the impacts of our early experiences. She is our emotional body and how we somaticize emotions. She is the holder of memory. And she does hold that place in the chart of primary caretaker, which for many of us traditionally has been the woman, but of course isn't always. And that, with that come all of our ideas about what mother is, but it can be the whole range of experiences. But because of that intimacy of the moon being the closest celestial body and expressing those very intimate parts of the self, like when you notice somebody's natal moon, you know how they need to be taken care of emotionally. So because of that, I think it may be even more important to think that through for yourself and what that choice is, and different moons in different people's charts and different ways of feeling that in your own chart might be gendered in really different ways. The truth is, we don't have the language yet. We really don't have the language yet. And it gets, jumping ahead to the rage question at the end of the podcast. No, but I'm looking forward to a time when we can talk more fluidly about these topics because we have more expansive language. I continue to consciously use those she, her pronouns for the moon, but that's my own personal choice about my moon, my 0-degree Cancer moon in the second house, and the way that I really, in some ways, own and embody a more traditional elder mother archetype in my own self and my own work and my own identity. So it's more a reflection of that than what I think anybody else should be applying to their own moon or the moon. It slips out of my mouth, she, her.
Oh,
because
no,
that's
that's great. I love hearing your perspective. And I've asked all the astrologers and herbalists this for this mini series because we do just naturally kind of slip out. Sometimes it's they, sometimes it's he, sometimes it's she. And so I'm always just curious how people have come to that. And everyone has had very thoughtful responses. So thank you for that. Can you tell us more about? Maybe before we go into like, this is what the moon represents and the associations, we'll get into that. But can you tell us about your relationship with the moon? When did you know that this was going to be such a significant relationship for you?
Yeah, I love this question. And actually, whenever I teach workshops on the moon, it's one of the questions that I lead with is I ask people to think about a significant memory in which the moon plays a part, because we all have those memories, usually early memories. And they're usually memories of beautiful contact with nature, or they're memories of gathering together with people that we love, or they're memories of intimacy, or they're memories of reaching outward into the natural world for comfort during times of trauma. Those are almost the universals. I've heard a lot of stories of formative memories of the moon now, and almost all of them have one of those qualities of gathering, of first intimations of the sacredness of nature, of looking outside ourselves for comfort when human life becomes unbearable, often as a child. And then there's the classic memory of riding in the car as a little child and realizing that the moon follows you. So I think within all of us, there's that archetypal awakening and awareness of this companion of the earth who is always there. And again, going back to that metaphor of the gateway, I'm built astrologically to be extraordinarily receptive to the moon. For many of us within their charts, there's a planet called the final dispositor, who's like the CEO of the chart. They get to make all the decisions. Not everybody's chart lines up that way, but for many of us, there's one that everybody else answers to. For me, that's the moon. She's in her rulership in Cancer. She's at 0 degrees, which is a potent seed degree. She's conjunct my North Node and my Venus. So I'm kind of set up to be a moon person. And I grew up on the Bay of Fundy, like right on the Bay of Fundy, outside of my bedroom window. So I grew up with that really profound connection to extreme tides and an understanding from a really early age that the tide and the moon were connected. I was a lonely only child with lots of trauma that kind of connected and bonded with nature and with the tides and with the moon. So for me, those memories are that early connection with nature being so supportive, and the moon being a constant, a fluctuating constant, which is the paradox of her presence, right? And a realization of her impact on us, literally, the way that she moves the tides, and spiritually, metaphorically, the way she holds that presence and witnessing that I think we often feel that's so hard to describe. When we see her, we feel witnessed by something we can't really name or put our finger on. So she's been a presence for me. This is the she too, because in many ways I wasn't mothered very well. And she was my mother. So that's actually a really profound question. And when I put myself back there, it's that, and the blessings of my childhood were that close contact with nature, dark night sky, and learning about the stories of the night sky, and that presence of the ocean and the moon. Yeah.
That's so touching. And I'm so glad you had her in such an available and accessible way as that mothering figure. As sort of a counterpoint to that, not knowing who my biological dad is, having no contact, and growing up with my mom, my 3 aunties, my grandma, and my great grandma in this like 2-3 bedroom house, like 2 bedroom with a basement house and 1 bathroom, like very, very lunar kind of energy in many ways. And I used to always just feel that I was a child of the cosmos on my dad's side. That I just like came from the universe, which is like maybe more of a Saturnian thing, like somewhere
Yeah.
out there, there's this kind of thing.
And sort of
Um,
your Athena, right?
yeah,
Um,
yeah. So I can relate to that feeling.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So okay, if you were introducing the moon to somebody in terms of planetary propitiation, magic, we're doing AstroMagic, and you were like, okay, this is what the moon represents in astrology, what would you say the moon rules or relates to? You've mentioned many things, but if we were just like, here's a guideline, what would you say?
And as we enter into that idea of planetary magic and propitiation and remediation, it's important to make the distinction between the planets and the luminaries because they represent really different energies and places in our lives and charts. So the luminaries, of course, being the lights of our life, the sun and the moon, and the moon holding lunar consciousness, the sun holding solar consciousness. The best way to express that is to think about when we walk outside in the daylight and look about, we see the edges of things, we're able to name things, we see the details of things really clearly, and the places that separate things are very, very clear. And we can navigate really easily with our obvious senses, right?
Mm-hmm.
Navigate with our vision. Walk into the same landscape at night, and everything has lost its edges. We can no longer clearly define or name or even see individual things. Everything has merged together. And in order to navigate, and here's a piece that I recommend that people do in order to engage with lunar consciousness, is to go outside and into a familiar landscape on a very dark, say, new moon night, and just find your way around and embody that difference between lunar and solar consciousness. So it's an awakening of a heightening of the senses because we need to rely on more than our vision. It's an acknowledgement that things in our environment are always changing, that they're shape shifting, that edges are not a guarantee, that there's different approaches to the way that we move through the world. And the black box of the brain does different things at different times. So the lights behave differently in our lives than the planets because we depend on the sun for our life. The moon holds that intimacy of our life on Earth. So when we work with these as archetypes and think about engaging in magic with the sun and moon and engaging in propitiation or remediation is not so much necessary because these are our life givers anyway. So I think of being in relationship with the moon. How do we deepen that relationship? So first thing, just be with her, be with the moon. Even without knowing your natal moon, just get outside every day and try to find her in the sky. Even just doing that for one lunar month, that exercise of trying to find her in the sky, because she will surprise you. If you haven't learned the lunar cycle and its intricacies and how it changes from day to day, it's a beautiful way to learn it. It's just to get outside and find her every day and watch her changes and talk to her. So number one, you want to get intimate with the moon, develop a one-on-one relationship with her. If we think about traditional ways to heighten that relationship with the moon, wear silver, wear gray, wear a moonstone, work with moonstones. Lunar herbs, sandalwood is something that I've been really enjoying as a plant that connects us to the moon. There are lots of lunar herbs, and I'm sure there's other people that can speak with more expertise on that than I. But I've been diffusing sandalwood. Not only does it help us to enter into that lunar consciousness and dream state and heightens our intuition, which belongs to the moon, but it's a way of honoring the moon. Create little altars to the moon at the lunations, at the new or the full moon. This is such an important, and I know this is a really important practice for you too, Carmen, that altar building is a connection to the divine and to the archetypes. So this is something I do monthly, is create a moon altar. And know your natal moon after you've done all of those things. Know your natal moon and understand that you can use the qualities of your natal moon to more deeply understand the transiting moon. So those are some starting places. Some people like to make infusions with the moon. I think this is something that I would encourage you to do when you have advanced a little bit in your understanding of how the moon in relationship with all of the other planets affects the energy in every given moment. Because when we come to making potions or making talismans, the idea with that is that you're capturing the essence of a moment. So having just a little more wisdom and knowledge about what exactly you're capturing is really important. Not to discourage people from going out and making your full moon water if that lights you up. I think that's beautiful, but it's also really helpful to know what else you're capturing with that. Because she translates the light, right? This is from the ancient astrologers, this idea of translating the light actually has a specific technical meaning in traditional astrology, but I like it as a metaphor for the gateway role that she plays in our lives. She is taking the light of the sun and all of the other planetary and stellar lights in the sky, holding them within herself and assimilating them, digesting them, like pre-digesting those lights for us. We can't look straight at the sun, but we can look at the raw sunlight directly through the face of the moon. And all of the other stellar and planetary lights reflected through her too. So technically we can use that in our astrology, but just knowing that idea, I think also brings us back to her purpose in our lives, which is to make those archetypal energies more real and bringing them into a human scale and making them available to our individual consciousness and our individual dream time. Just as a caretaker will prepare food for an infant, whether you're preparing it through your body or preparing it with love with your hands, you aren't just giving adult food directly to an infant. It would be too much. It would overwhelm the system. Just like that solar light and even some of the archetypal light of the planets, it's too much for our human psyches to take in. The moon translates that light to us so we can understand it, absorb it, and work with it. That's just part of the magic that she delivers, that ability to bring those archetypes down to a level where we can hold them in our bodies and psyches.
I love that you're bringing up archetypes because there are different archetypes of the moon because she has these different lunations. She has different phases. So this is one of the reasons why working with the moon, it is like a pretty fun and on the one hand easy, but on the other hand really expansive place to start with our planetary magic, because there's just so many different aspects to her. And like you say, she cycles really quickly. So in like a season, you could have had like some pretty good practice at what is the different quality between dark moon, new moon, balsamic, that kind of thing. So would you, since this is so unique to working with the moon, would you mind taking us through the major lunations and different archetypes that could kind of speak to her different phases?
I would love to. I would love to. This is a passion of mine, is working with those phases of the moon. Just a word about phases. This, again, also is a cultural thing. There are as many phases of the moon as there are moments in her cycle, and we can define that lots of different ways. In our culture and in our astrology, we take on that idea of quartering the circle, right? Which is putting the cross of matter together with the circle of spirit and defining time and defining space with those two symbols. So we do the same when we work with the phases of the moon. But I just think it's important to know that this is one really beautiful, really valid way of working with her changes over the course of the month, but there's lots of different ways to do it. So we recognize 8 major phases of the moon. So we take, of course, the new moon is the beginning, the new moon being when the moon and sun come together. So the moon isn't creating these phases by herself. It's a dance between the sun, the moon, and the earth. So it's interesting to think of it in that light, because you might hear my dog snoring. If there's background, it's my pug. She snores, and sometimes people are put off by that, but she's snoozing and having dream time. That's perfect pug.
It's perfect.
Very much part of my world. So 29 days to get through that lunar cycle, the phase cycle, which starts when the moon meets the sun, right? The sun takes, of course, 12 months to go through the entire zodiac. The moon takes just that 1 month. So she's lapping the sun. So once a month, she's lapped around and met up with the sun. That's the new moon. It's the luminaries coming together, the moon in the lap of the sun, the moon in the inner sanctum. They're whispering secrets together and making the plan for the coming month. The new moon, it's dark. We're in full lunar consciousness. It's dark with no light.
It seems kind of primordial when you put it that way.
Yes. And I love that word for it. It's like the primal gestational dark. It's the dark in which things have the opportunity to grow before they reach the light. So that's the essence of the new moon, is conception. It's that dark and fertile space that allows for conception, which is something that happens outside of consciousness, away from the light, in that primal darkness. So we get to repeat that creative cycle every month that begins in that primal darkness and begins with conception. I've developed a set of questions called the lunar keys, which are questions for reflection for each of the major phases that I think help us to connect with that archetype and that energy of each phase. And the one for the new moon is, what is being conceived? I think in popular astrology, there's a lot of emphasis on manifesting with the new moon, and it's great. I'm all about that. I think we can definitely use her cycles for goal setting and for getting the things we want in life. But before that, there's dropping into the mystery and asking, what is beginning in my life? Because that's really what that's about. For anybody who has had the experience of physically conceiving a child, we know that usually happens without our conscious awareness. And that after that happens, we still have no idea who it is that we've conceived. There's so much that's still hidden. And that's really the essence of the new moon. Something is conceived, we don't know what yet. As she takes light, we'll know more and more. When I say know, I mean, we know, the body knows, the deep heart and mind know, but the conscious mind doesn't know. The solar aspect doesn't know. So next is the crescent moon. She's taken a little bit of light. And there we can start to see what's developing. So this is kind of that moment when the plant bursts out of, when the seed breaks apart, maybe hasn't emerged from the earth yet, but you get those 2 little first leaves and there's an emergence. The light emerges, and that's the energy that crescent moon carries, is an emergence. We start to see what it is that has been conceived and begin to be able to define it. What is emerging is the question that we can reflect on during that phase. The quarter moons, okay, and there's confusion with the naming here, because when we look up in the sky, we see half of the face of the moon. So sometimes people say half moon. It's actually the quarter moon because it's 1/4 of the way through the cycle, 90 degrees from the sun. So in astrology, that's called a square aspect, very dynamic. So what happens when you look up in the sky and see that sharp line on the moon? It's going to be one of the sharpest days of the month. It's a day of choice. When the moon gets to that point, she's half light, half dark. She's going either darker or lighter from there. And it's usually a time when we can think about what needs to be adjusted. If we think about the growth cycle, it's like when we have to start to pull out some of those seedlings because there's so much has grown. And we have to make those hard cutting decisions. And you will notice this if you start your lunar observance and you notice those days, look at that sharp edge. It's the only time we see a sharp edge on the face of the moon. And you'll feel that sharpness in your life that day. Yeah, it's time to cut through something and make a decision. So we can ask, what needs adjustment? The first quarter is different than the last quarter because it's adjusting at the beginning instead of adjusting towards the end. So in real time, this is only a weekend. Next is when we see that ripe moon. She's not quite full. You look up, you're like, oh, it's a full moon. No, it's not quite. Just that like ripening belly of the moon. And that's the idea of the gibbous phase. It's ripening. It's that you're talking about the raspberries in your garden. I've got them in my garden too now. And you go out every day and you're like squeezing them a little bit, waiting to see if they're ready to drop. So gibbous, now you can hear Pearl. Gibbous is just, you're thinking, tomorrow that one's going to drop off the vine. The full moon, of course, is when the fruit is ready. So at the gibbous moon, we ask, what is ripening? And we can look around in our life and think about what is ripening right now. Then the full moon, that we're also familiar with. Intensity and illumination, because the sun and moon are across from each other. So we can see, this is like the intrusion of solar light on lunar consciousness. We can see all of the edges of things. We walk out in the night, it's still a night vision, but we can see the edges of things. And it's there's a cognitive dissonance almost to that illumination. And we see things that have been shrouded in shadow for, however long that cycle is, because the lunar cycle connects to longer cycles. So what is being illuminated under the intensity of that full moon? Then we come to the disseminating moon, when you see that ripeness, but it's starting to recede. That's like the seed pod bursting. It's time to, whatever's been created and is fully ripe at the full moon now needs to go out into the world. It's when we let go of things, like you recently wrote and released a book. It's that the full moon is like, it's finished. It's gone to the publisher. And then the disseminating phase is like, oh my gosh, people are starting to read it. I can't change it anymore. It's gone out into the world. It's being released. And that is the tension of that disseminating moon, is that energy of putting something out there that has reached its fullness. And that's it. It's now out there. There's a vulnerability to that phase of the moon, but also an excitement. So we ask, what is being released? And it's release in the sense of like a book release, not so much in like, oh, I have this, I'm done with this, so I'm releasing it. We get to that with the comic. Last quarter moon, again, that sharp line. What is ending? Do we need to cut away? And finally, the balsamic, which is actually my favorite phase of the moon. And the question for that is, what is essential? We're returning to darkness. And the image that I have for that is, we've created something over this whole cycle. And we can't carry all of it with us, right? We've had that time to grow something, to release parts of it, to cut away parts of it. And now we're left with something. It's distilled down, it's balsamic. It's distilled down to something thick and rich, the essence of something. And at the balsamic moon, we can have that imagery of distilling down our experience of the lunar month and letting go of everything except that rich essence that we want to carry over into the next cycle. So balsamic, what is essential? So we've walked through that whole creative cycle. And this is what I mean by gateway. If you understand each of those phases of the cycle, each planet walks through those phases in their own time. And so many of our biological cycles and our creative cycles follow that pathway. And we've been sold a line in our culture that it's all about between the new and the full moon, that's the only part of the cycle that we're interested in, is when we're gaining, when we're growing, when we're striving for completion. And then it's just over. You're supposed to, without any rest, without any release, without any time to darken and deepen, you're supposed to jump into the next cycle. It's not how nature works, not how the moon works, not how we work.
Totally. I love that you brought that up. So thank you for that amazing recapitulation of the entire lunation. This is just beautiful. Probably in 2000 and, I want to say like 9 or 10 or 11 or something like that, I really started, I guess I was just sort of enchanted with applying the phases of the moon to my work. And then when I like left my job in the wine and spirits industry and was working for myself in 2012, 2013, something like that, I was pretty committed for quite a long time to being like, okay, there are times of the month that are going to be about generativity, and then times of the month where I'm just going to coast and I'm going to like, I'm not going to start new things. And this is when I'm going to tie up loose ends. And I actually found it a very, very useful way to live. So I know that there are lots of people, people who menstruate who might follow the moon as well for different reasons. And maybe if you work for yourself, or if there's, you can try to apply some agency as to like when you're going to rest. But that's something that I found very helpful for me just as a human mammal on the planet to go, yeah, there are times when I can be big and visible and open and out there, and then times of the month when I can't. And I haven't ever really been able to keep it consistent with the actual moon, but I still keep to that. I usually take like the third or like the last full week of the month is my like quote unquote admin week, where I'm just wrapping up, finishing things off. I don't do new client appointments. I don't do, I don't teach. I'm just like in my lunar consciousness of I have to get very internal, and I have to know that I have that kind of restorative period every month. Are you like that? Like how much have you oriented your life around lunations?
The more I do, the more reward I gain from it. And 2 years ago, I started that same practice of reserving 1 week a month as an admin week. I try not to take any meetings at all during that week. I have a lot of sensory issues. So a lot of it's just, my brain needs a break. I work during those weeks, but it's just as you've described. And it's the week itself is restful and transformative, but knowing that it's coming helps me to modulate my energy. And it's really been a game changer. And I know like you and I are in the position of being entrepreneurs. So you know what they say, you get to choose the 80 hours a week that you work. But we do have a lot of agency over our own schedules, and not everybody has the privilege of that. But even if you can integrate these ideas in small ways, if there are things that you can give yourself a break from during that last week of the cycle. And I actually really notice when it gets thrown off, because sometimes a calendar week doesn't match, just doesn't with what's happening with the moon. And the closer I can keep it to being right before the new moon, the better, because I do find that my energy bottoms out right before the new moon. Everyone's body is so different with this. And I find it really interesting. You're talking about people who menstruate and that relationship with the moon, which is complex in itself. And I think there's some sort of essentializing around that and some ideas of how we should menstruate with the moon. And there's a lot of different ways that we do or don't, and it's all good. But for me, when I went through menopause, my relationship with the moon really deepened because I didn't have this sort of overriding hormonal cycle that was intense. And it's kind of the primary or root cycle that I worked with. And once that leveled out, I found that both the lunar and planetary cycles became a lot more available to me. So again, thinking about elderhood and some of that good stuff that we're not taught about, this has been one of the biggest rewards for me of being postmenopausal, is deepening that connection with the moon and it just makes me curious biologically, like what's going on? Is my body actually more attuned to those lunar cycles because it doesn't have the noise of the hormonal cycle of and I had a very intense hormonal cycle of my reproductive years. So
This is very exciting to hear as somebody firmly in perimenopause. And we've been
Yeah.
having perimeno jams in the network where I feel like it's all I ever talk about with people. So I do try to like keep it contained on the podcast, but pretty much anyone wants to talk about the transition from menstruating to not. I love hearing people's experience of how that changes. So I love this idea that there's less signal maybe
Yeah.
coming in, or maybe less noise, more signal, I guess is the way
Yeah.
that it would go.
Yeah.
That's really exciting to think about.
It's really exciting. And it was such an unexpected transformation because there's such a sense of loss that can accompany that transition. And we spend less time thinking about what's actually being gained. And there's such an interesting thing that happens when all of that energy isn't being used to track along the hormonal cycle, where there's a whole part of us that becomes so much more available. And I love that about being postmenopausal. Yeah, I mean, when the years that I was perimenopausal, I spent a lot of time talking, thinking, writing about. I created a whole program around menopause and as a spiritual rite of passage and positive menopause. So I'm right there. It's a fascinating talk about gateways, like the gateway into elderhood, and it's been so diminished in our society. So I'm really happy that you're doing that and really deepening into that work right now, because it's really an exciting rite of passage. It has a lot of painful aspects to it and so much beauty and reward when during and after. And it's tremendous how it has expanded my work as an astrologer and my ability to really align with the planetary cycles. It's like something opens up that's more expansive, that we've been using in a more focused and granular way during our reproductive years. So it's really interesting to walk through that and feel that connection more strongly. And I think sometimes when you're in the years when you're menstruating, if you're a person who menstruates, you're connected to the moon, there's a fear that you're going to lose that lunar connection, but it's actually the opposite that happens.
Oh,
Yeah.
how inspiring. And
Yeah.
is there a phase of the moon? Like, are we thinking of this fairly typically, that you have a certain phase of the moon cycle that you relate to in elderhood? Like, do you still totally relate to full moon the same way you used to, or are there times of the lunar cycle that you are more looking forward to than others?
I've never really thought that through, but maybe because I definitely feel the charm of the balsamic moon these days in my life. Maybe that is to the stage of life that I'm in. But I think there's other things that affect that as well, as with our stage of life. One being the phase of the moon that we were born under. I was born under a new moon. I love the new moon and just what you're going through in life. But as we come into elderhood and begin to see the beauties of elderhood, we do maybe deepen our understanding of those dark phases of the moon. I don't know. There's a part of that can be really reductive too, with the kind of new moon, full moon, dark moon. There's truth there for sure in our life cycle, but all of those phases of life are so much more expansive than just relating them to one phase of the moon. And come in at different levels of maturity into their lives as well. And it's interesting to see how that tracks with lunar, with the lunar phase they were born under. But in general, I think yes, that I have a greater appreciation of that. The last quarter moon's always tough, but I love a good balsamic moon.
That sounds great. My kiddo was born under a balsamic moon, and so I have this strong sense of like what kind of personality that's like, or how they straddle different worlds, or how they're always kind of like between things. And so I am charmed by and allured by balsamic moons, even though I personally have felt the most resonance with new moon. I think I was born in first quarter, but I have to double check that. But I have found I can access that lunar consciousness and the part of me that I feel is like my most spiritual self, my most intuitive self, my wisest self. I feel like my dreams are the most prophetic. I really do feel kind of like a stereotype where I really get into new moon. But certainly looking forward to appreciating the charms of
Yeah.
balsamic and even like that last quarter. What are some of the rituals that you personally like to do? If you, so you've talked about these different phases, and so there would be different rituals that you might do at different times. What are some of your go-to? Like if you were like, okay, new person who wants
Yeah.
to be doing AstroMagic, here's what you should have in your toolkit for rituals to work with the moon.
Number one, just that thing that I said off the top, which is daily
Mhm.
communion with the moon herself. And then on top of that, I would add an altar building practice where you take the new moon and create an altar for the new moon on the, sometime in that 3 days. Okay. Each phase is about a little bit more than 3 days. And you can modulate that depending on how much of the mystery you want to invite in, or how much sort of agency and conscious control you want to have over the outcome of any of those new moon rituals. The more light she takes, the more conscious control you have over outcomes. And, different times call for different approaches to that. So building an altar to the new moon that's kind of stripped down and bare, just kind of the, 4 directions, center, honor something about the nature of that moon, like the sign that new moon is in, or something in your own chart or in your own life that you're hoping to grow and work on. Simple symbols of that, leaving lots of space. And I mean, I have 4 planets in Taurus, so I love this idea of kitchen magic and actually putting our hands on things and having a physical place in our homes. And I'm all about building altars on little trays so you can take it with you. You can get it up out of sight of visitors if you want to, or small hands. So this very simple practice of having a lovely tray, building a simple altar on it for the new moon, continuing to be aware as the days go on and the phases go by, and maybe adding an object or two to the altar for each of the major phases. And when we get to the balsamic moon, it's that most important work of stripping it down and looking at all of the objects that you've collected on that altar over the course of the month and what they represent for you, and doing that work of asking what is essential kind of through that month-long process of altar building. So even that is a really simple and beautiful place to start. Face-to-face communion with the moon herself, and then building and dismantling that altar sort of in tune with her expanding and waning, and then releasing it, cleaning it up, making everything, refreshed, and cleaning the tray and washing your crystals and all of that in time for the new moon, start it all over again. New moon practices of bathing in the ocean, taking a salt bath, purification rituals, whatever that means to you, that balsamic new moon time, like you said, that we're straddling the time out of time, between worlds, between phases, between cycles, to honor that very simply with decluttering, cleaning, certainly cleaning your altar and sacred spaces, cleaning your body in a ritual way, or bathing in the ocean or some kind of living water. For either the balsamic or the new moon is a really beautiful way to connect. I like to write and dream with the moon. So I keep a dream journal that's keyed to the moon. You can write down the phase that she's in, but also even getting more granular, the degree and sign. And very magical things start to happen when you dream with the moon, and connecting, especially connecting with the dead around, if you know their charts or charts of ancestors that you want to connect with. They will come to you when the moon is at the degree of their sun often. So she very much, talk about translating the light, like there's a very real and practical way in which she opens certain gateways to us at certain moments. And now we're talking the zodiacal cycle, where she is moving through the signs. So that dreaming with the moon can be very complex, or it can be as simple as inviting a dream for the new moon, what wants to be conceived in my life, inviting a dream for the full moon that is, what do I need to see? And accessing your lunar consciousness that way. Moon magic it's a great place to begin to practice magic, because once we venture into planetary magic, the precautions become more and more important as we work with bigger and bigger archetypes with longer and longer cycles and intense transpersonal impact. Practicing with the moon almost has this like childlike quality of like not much, with the exception of eclipses, really not much harm can come to you playing with lunar magic. So it's a great place to hone your magical skills and learn about self-protection in magic, and learn about appropriate magic, and learn about applying your own creativity to magic, because the moon is very forgiving. And really, there, again, with the very notable exception of eclipses, it's just a great practicing place. It's a great little lab in which to have magical skills without provoking volatile archetypes.
Right. So, okay, so you've mentioned eclipses a couple times, but also, do you give extra space or caution around times when the moon is void of course? And so, and I guess my follow-up would be around any times when you're applying caution to lunar magic, like why? What could be the negative outcomes?
So, void of course moon is, just to give the definition, this applies not to the phases of the moon, but to the moon through the zodiacal cycle. So she takes about 2 days to go through each sign. She'll make a final major aspect with one of the other planets. She'll have that last conversation before she leaves the party. The last major aspect that she makes in a sign kind of gives the vibe of that whole transit through that sign. And then after that last major aspect, she's what we call void of course. It's like you're at a party, you're talking to all the people, the moon's there talking to all the planets as she moves through, like she's in Sagittarius right now. So she'll talk to everybody while she's in Sag. And then she'll have that last conversation, like you're at the doorway, you're saying goodbye to your friend that hosted the party. And whatever happens during that conversation, maybe you have a little fight. Maybe you just shed some tears, or it's just a really beautiful conversation that you have. Whatever that mood is, you're carrying that mood as you're driving home, right? That's the void of course moon. The thing about doing stuff in the void of course moon, it's like an in-between time. So we say it's time for finishing stuff up. If you want your magic to have impact, don't do it during the void of course moon, not because something bad's going to happen, but because nothing much is going to happen. Nothing will come of it. Send in your taxes during the void moon is what my mentor always said. You know, you don't want to be off your tax. I do send in my taxes during the void moon. It's good for that kind of stuff. Like, I don't want to fuss about this. I don't want anything particular to come of it. That's how we use the void moons, or just continuing with something that you're doing. Really, there's no harm that's going to come from it. One of the things that happens to us is, as we become astrologers, is we kind of it's an occupational hazard to get like overly concerned with whatever transits are happening, and kind of overschedule yourself and get overly worried about the impact of certain transits. The moon is a really important indicator. She's a trigger of other bigger transits. I think, to answer your question succinctly, with the exception of eclipses, there's not much harm you can do with lunar magic. And that's why it's a good laboratory. I mean, as long as you are exercising your common sense magical cautions, which is part of the wisdom that you always share too. So anybody who's listening to you is going to know already, because that's such a valuable part of the wisdom that you share, Carmen, is that just the common sense and yet very esoteric approaches to ritual, ceremony, and magic that keep us safe. All that applies to our practices, but the moon, it's like, imagine a very safe caretaker of a child. You're going to be able to, you're safe to do all kinds of behaviors that you might not want to do as an adult, or take out in front of somebody else in the world. The moon will hold that. So avoid of course moons, just because you're not going to have much impact during that time. Pay attention to the sign that she's in and who she's cohabitating with and talking to. Which other planets she's mingling with, because of that translation of the light. She absorbs and holds. That's like our intuition and our empathy. We absorb the energy of who we're with, and she does that with the planetary energies as well. But
what about eclipses?
Play. Yeah. So that's a kind of no fly, in my opinion, and there are very different opinions about this. Some people swear by eclipse magic. I think it's too much of a wild card. And in the hands of expert spirit workers, sure. But eclipses are a temporary cessation of the light and energy from either the moon or the sun. And there's something really profound about that. And I think that there is a reason that historically and across cultures, eclipses have been treated with respect and a little bit of fear. I never want to instill fear in people around astrology, but in my opinion, the purpose of eclipses is to go inwards, reflect, and meditate. And the very best use of eclipse energy is what it's going to bring to light for us. So if we start trying to use some conscious agency to make something happen during a very volatile period of time, it's not really the best use of that energy. That energy is about tuning into what needs to end in our lives, or what is ending, or what are the difficult truths that we need to face. And there's just a volatility that is bigger than our own energy that happens during those times. They're very, very sacred times. The whole eclipse window between the first and the last eclipse. So people will want to experiment with that because volatile energy is compelling. And, sometimes we learn by doing, and all magic is experimental, and we are always walking an edge with magic. But in my opinion, there are better uses of eclipse energy than trying to make shit happen, because it's already happening.
Right. Something's already happening. Okay. So thank you for that. My last question is a little bit different from what I usually ask, but familiar enough, I think. How would you say the moon can support us in our grief and our rage?
The moon is enduring and ever present. And the paradox of that is that she's always changing. And I think she can you hear Pearl snoring? Oh, you must be able to hear her now. It's always the background in my life. This is I almost don't have words for this, but there's something about bearing witness in a way that's both deeply empathetic and also kind of stoic, that presence of the moon has. She bears those craters on her face that are the evidence of so many impacts over the course of her geological life. And she holds that place in our heart that carries those impacts of the things that have hit us hard. And she's always there to witness us. So I think it's that power of ever-changing presence and always being carried out of the darkness into light, always being carried out of the light into darkness. Just the reminder that that's the nature of our lives here. It's inexorable. It's kind of terrifying, but it's also incredibly beautiful and comforting to have that validated by something that's so far away and yet so close. And she is capable of holding all of it. Going back to those early memories that I was sharing, the humans around us are full of their own grief and rage and foibles and failings. And even even nature can feel like she fails us sometimes. But that stoical, ever-present face of the moon reflects both the hopelessness and the deepest hope, I think, that we have, and holds that. So it holds us in that place of paradox, which is kind of the essence of these times too, that what we are facing is unbearable, and yet we are the ones that are here to bear witness and to face it. And something about seeing that reflected at such a great distance, but yet so close. I don't want to call it comfort, but it's something like comfort.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Ah, thank you, Bronwyn, for leading us to this place that's so, well, it just feels so lunar.
Right?
I feel very in touch with lunar consciousness right now.
We were both crying.
Yeah, both wet and yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful. I really appreciate you being here to share your wisdom. I wanted to have you on for a long time. I think this was the perfect venue. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much. It was just a pleasure, such a deep pleasure to be here and share this with you.
I love listening to Bronwyn. If you want to learn more from her, Bronwyn is leading a live round of her signature program, Light of the Moon, and the live round is starting July 17th. But it's this very cool hybrid system where you could buy it right away and you'll get these 8 recorded modules that you can dive into immediately. And then you can join into the flow of these 4 live weekly calls starting with the new moon in July. So I love that hybrid system. Might adopt something like that myself in the future. It just sounds so great. I also would like to thank SJS, who left a review on Amazon for my book, The Spirited Kitchen. So big listener shout out to SJS. They gave my book 5 stars and they said, "I love this book so much. Recipes, lore, and more for the head witch in all of us. A fun read and even more fun to practice from." 5 stars to you, SJS. That was an awesome review. Succinct. You nailed it. 3 lines. So sweet. I love it. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's leaving reviews on Amazon, on Goodreads, on Thrift Books, wherever, or Chapters Indigo, wherever you purchased. Reviews make such a difference in the life of book sales. So really appreciate that. The Numinous Network is where we cross-pollinate concepts from spirituality and neuroscience, attachment theory, polyvagal theory, trauma recovery, collapse awareness. I swear there's a through line there, and you only have to spend a short while with us to see it clearly. The Numinous Network is an ecosystem of support for your personal growth, and this summer we're giving extra attention to planets and plant magic. So if you enjoyed this, I hope you'll come check us out in the network. At the very least, I hope you'll stick around for the rest of this mini-series. You can learn more about the Numinous Network at carmenspagnola.com. CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.